Conventional wisdom says when the markets are up, God must be pleased with me. When our territory is expanding and everybody's prospering, it must mean that we've got God on our side. And similarly, conventional wisdom says when times are bad, when finances aren't as good, when people aren't making as much money, it must mean that God is upset with us. We human beings have this way of taking a look at our immediate circumstances, whether I've got more income in my pocket or my bank account's doing healthier, and assuming that equals God's approval or disapproval. It turns out this is the kind of thing that the people of God have been wrestling with for literally millennia, certainly even centuries before Jesus' time, when the conventional wisdom was, if the markets were up, we must have God's favor on us, we must be doing great. And God would from time to time raise up people, prophets, whose job was to say, whoa, just because you've got a handful of people who are making a bunch of money, or just because some people are really, really wealthy, doesn't mean that we have God's favor. What God really has wanted from us was to be people who practice justice and righteousness. And God can't be fooled into us doing a handful of rituals or offering up some simple, easy sacrifices in order to get God to look the other way when we're mistreating each other or taking advantage of the poor. In fact, we're going to see in this brand new series we're starting on Thursdays called Good Trouble, a study of the book of Amos, that one of the really, really important early figures in Israel's history was a prophet named Amos who called the people to reject the old conventional wisdom, to say even when the markets were up, it didn't mean that God was happy with the people, and similarly that maybe what God really wanted was not for a handful of people to be making $1 gajillion, or shekels, I suppose, but for people to live with justice and mercy, that God couldn't be bought off with their acts of overt religion, and that God cared when a handful of people were so comfortable in their opulence and their well-to-do way of life that they could carefully ignore the needs of other people while people went homeless in the street or lost all their belongings to predatory lending. It turns out those are the kinds of issues going on in the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BC, and it turns out we maybe even thousands of years later need voices like Amos's that remind us that when I'm just comfortable in getting by doesn't mean that I've automatically got God's favor, that God cares about how we relate to each other, and that God cares more about how we practice justice with each other than how we perform religious rituals. We're going to discover over these coming weeks that the prophet Amos was willing to risk getting himself at the top of the enemies list, both of the king and of the official religious establishment, because he was willing to call them out and to say, God cares about how we treat each other, not just how the markets are doing and how much money we're making or how much our professional religious rituals are doing. So we invite you this coming Thursday to start that journey with us into the book of Amos. And to get ourselves started, we're going to take a look in the opening chapters of Amos, how Amos does something really, really clever. He gets his listeners on his side. I mean, nobody wants to hear anybody call them out, and nobody wants to have somebody point out the faults I don't want to admit in myself. We're going to notice how Amos does that in a really, really clever, powerful way. He starts out by taking shots at all the neighboring nations around Israel and saying, well, here's something God's upset about with you, and God's upset with you, and God's upset with those people over there and those people. And you can just imagine Amos's listeners going, yeah, you tell them, prophet. Yeah, God's mad at all those people, our enemies, all those foreigners around us. God's upset at all the bad things they're doing. And if you get a map out, you can even see how Amos is sort of making a ring around ancient Israel. And then he goes in for the bullseye. And once he's got his listeners on his side, and they think, yeah, he's calling out unrighteousness. Yeah, let's you tell those bad people out there. And then Amos can go, well, it turns out the problem isn't just out there. The problem is in here with us. The call is coming from inside the house, so to speak. And it turns out from there, Amos can get his listeners' attention to say the problem isn't just with other people. The problem is with us. God isn't just mad at other nations. God is concerned with the way we have broken righteousness and justice. That's hard, but that's an important message. So join us this Thursday as we begin a new series called Good Trouble, taking a look at how an ancient prophet is willing to put himself in risky situations, even making himself a troublemaker in the eyes of the king and of the religious establishment, for the sake of bringing God's news of justice and of righteousness, and to call people back to faithfulness to God in our actions and our lives. Not just the words that come out of our mouths or the empty gestures that we perform. We might well discover that Amos's message is one we need today, even in the 21st century as well. So join us here Thursdays at 1 o'clock, or catch up with these video summaries as well, as together this summer we get into good trouble. See you along the way.